What if the night sky held secrets so vast that it could change everything we know about our world? 7 strangers in a small town witnessed something that would forever alter the course of their lives and perhaps the truth of humanity itself. The night was calm in the small town nestled among the rolling hills of northern Italy. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was just another ordinary evening, or so it seemed. The townspeople had settled into their routines, heading home from work, stopping by cafes, and enjoying the serenity of a typical evening. But for 7 strangers, the world would shift in the span of a few minutes. It started as nothing more than a flash in the sky, something so brief that one might have brushed it off as a trick of the light. But the light didn't fade. It hovered, shifting in a way that was too deliberate to be any natural phenomenon. The people who saw it first were scattered across the town, completely unaware of the others. One was a woman walking her dog through the empty streets, another a man on his balcony, enjoying the quiet of the night, while yet another was at a small cafe, sipping on his espresso. As the strange light remained suspended, their curiosity grew. One by one, they stepped outside or leaned over their balconies to get a better look. The object, whatever it was, didn't move the way any aircraft should. It darted, stopped suddenly, and changed colors. As if drawn by an invisible force, more and more people found themselves gazing at the same spot in the sky, all of them feeling a mixture of awe and confusion. Among them was Luca, a retired engineer who had lived in the town for decades. He had never believed in things like this, UFOs, alien encounters. But what he saw that night made him pause. The object wasn't just hovering. It was alive in a way, shifting, pulsating with an eerie light that sent a shiver down his spine. Others began to notice, too, the way it seemed to react to their movements, as if it was aware of them, watching them. For some, the encounter was fleeting. A quick glance up at the sky, a shake of the head, and they returned to their lives. But for the 7 strangers, something inexplicable had taken place. It wasn't just the lights they had seen, it was the feeling that something larger was at play. The sense of being drawn into something they couldn't quite understand, a mystery unfolding right in front of them. They wouldn't know it yet, but this night, this strange encounter, would tie their fates together in a way that nothing could ever undo. As they slowly began to share their experiences with one another, they realized the truth. The UFO wasn't just a shared vision. It had left an indelible mark on each of them. Something had changed that night, and none of them could escape the questions that would follow. The following evening, the sky was clear once more, and the town fell back into its quiet routine. However, for the 7 witnesses, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The flash of light they had seen the night before lingered in their minds, a puzzle they couldn't piece together. Some of them tried to dismiss it as a trick of the eye, a fluke. But deep down, they knew it was something more. At first, the lights were subtle, a soft glow off in the distance, barely visible against the darkening horizon. A few of the witnesses, still haunted by the previous night's encounter, scanned the sky, half expecting to see something again. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a distant star or a plane flying overhead, but then it flickered, pulsing in a way that no aircraft could. It darted across the sky, far too quickly to be any conventional object, and just as abruptly, it vanished. The witnesses felt a sudden chill crawl up their spines. The air grew colder as they stared at the spot where the light had just been. A woman named Sophia, who had been walking along the cobbled streets, clutched her coat tighter around her shoulders. The eerie stillness of the evening seemed to amplify the strange sensation she felt in the pit of her stomach. Something wasn't right. The others, unaware of Sophia's unease, began to speak up. "Did you see that?" Luca asked, his voice shaking slightly. "It came from nowhere, and then it just disappeared. His words hung in the air, thick with uncertainty. They gathered, unknowingly drawn together by the same strange force, all looking up at the sky. It happened again. The lights appeared, this time closer, more intense. This wasn't the kind of light any of them had seen before. There was no aircraft or celestial body that moved like this. The object hovered for several seconds before shooting off in a different direction with unnerving speed. Fear began to spread among them, but so did a strange sense of wonder. What were they witnessing? The question lingered between them, unspoken but shared by all. The light seemed to play with their perceptions, moving in ways that defied logic, as if mocking their attempts to understand. The more they tried to grasp what was happening, the more elusive the answers became. In that moment, their curiosity turned to dread. The lights seemed purposeful, almost aware of their gaze. And with each flash, each movement in the sky, they felt more certain that this wasn't a mere coincidence. Whatever was up there was aware of them, watching them. A deep unease settled over the group. They were no longer just passive observers, they had become part of something larger, something that would change them forever. As the lights hovered in the sky, the witnesses stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the strange phenomenon unfolding above them. The initial shock hit like a tidal wave, and for a moment, none of them could find words. The usual sounds of the town seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the unsettling hum of the air around them. Each of them, in their own way, tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Luca, the youngest of the group, was the first to speak. His voice was shaky, barely audible. Is this real?" he asked, half expecting someone to answer, half hoping someone would deny it. He had been skeptical at first, assuming it was just an optical illusion. But now, standing in the chilling silence, he couldn't deny the truth. What they were witnessing wasn't ordinary. His heart raced, and his body felt heavy, like a weight had settled on him. Sophia, the woman who had been the most cautious, stepped back, her hand trembling as she clutched the fabric of her coat. Her breath quickened, and she couldn't tear her eyes away from the object. Fear gripped her chest, tightening like a vice. It wasn't just the unusual nature of the lights that unsettled her, it was the way they moved. She had never seen anything behave like that in the sky. The way they darted in erratic patterns, paused, then shifted again with unnatural precision, made her question everything she knew. "It can't be," she whispered to herself, her mind scrambling for a logical explanation. Stefano, standing just a few paces away, could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. His instinct was to run, to escape whatever was happening, but his feet felt like they were glued to the earth. He tried to reason with himself, telling his mind that it was just a plane or a satellite, something he could explain away. But as the lights flickered and shifted once again, his rational thoughts began to break apart. He turned to the group, looking for comfort or a sense of clarity, but no one else seemed to have the answers either. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. Carla, a tourist from a nearby city, was the most vocal. She had come to the town to relax, to escape the noise of the city. And now she was facing something that could unravel everything she thought she knew. She was the first to point at the object, trying to bring some order to the chaos. "It's not moving like anything I've seen. A plane doesn't move like that." Her voice trembled, and her hands shook at her sides. She could feel her stomach tighten, her mind racing for any explanation, but nothing seemed to fit. The object wasn't behaving like anything from Earth. And then there was Alessandro, the most skeptical of them all. His eyes narrowed as he stared into the sky, trying to find a rational explanation. But nothing made sense. His heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat formed on his forehead. "No," he muttered, almost to himself. This isn't real." Yet, Despite the disbelief swirling in his mind, a nagging feeling in his gut told him that it was. The group stood there, immobilized, each one processing the sight in their own way. Fear, confusion, and disbelief fused into a collective experience. None of them could explain what they had seen, and deep down, each of them knew they would never forget this moment, no matter how much they wanted to. As the first whispers of the sighting reached the town's small cafes and local shops, reactions were mixed. Some dismissed it immediately, shaking their heads with a chuckle. The idea that something so extraordinary had happened in their quiet, sleepy town seemed far-fetched. It wasn't that they didn't believe in the possibility of something unusual, strange things happened in the world all the time. But a UFO? That was something out of a storybook. Most assumed it was a hoax, an elaborate prank, or perhaps a case of mass hysteria. Giovanni, the local baker, was the first to speak out against it. He laughed as he swept flour off the countertop, telling anyone who would listen that people just love to make up stories. They saw a light, and suddenly, "It's an alien invasion?" He scoffed, shaking his head. He wasn't alone in his skepticism. The more the story spread, the more eyes rolled, and the more dismissive gestures accompanied it. Maybe it was a plane, some said. Could have been a weather balloon or a trick of the light. It seemed like the most logical explanations, easy and comfortable. But not everyone was so certain. As the sun began to set on the following day, casting long shadows across the town, some of the witnesses couldn't shake the image of the lights in the sky. They had seen something, and no matter how hard they tried to convince themselves otherwise, the memory gnawed at them. Luca, who had been the first to question the sighting, now found himself searching for answers. He spent hours online, looking up anything that could explain what he had seen. There had to be a rational reason, he told himself. But the more he looked, the more he came across theories that made his stomach churn. He wasn't sure what it was, but the more he researched, the more the feeling of unease deepened. Sophia had been quiet since the night before, but her mind churned with questions. She couldn't explain it, but she knew the lights weren't like anything she had ever seen. They moved with a fluidity, a certainty that seemed too deliberate. Her thoughts kept returning to that moment of uncertainty, of being caught between belief and skepticism. And as she overheard more dismissive conversations around town, she realized there were others who felt the same sense of doubt creeping in. The small town became divided. The doubters outnumbered the believers, but the whispers grew louder as some began to question what they had seen. They started to talk more openly with each other, comparing their stories. They spoke of the strange patterns in the sky, the unnatural way the lights moved, how they had never seen anything like it before. Each time they spoke, a small sense of confirmation spread among them. They weren't crazy. They hadn't imagined it. But despite their doubts, fear lingered in the air. The uncertainty that once seemed like an absurdity now began to take root. And while some in the town maintained their skepticism, others couldn't help but wonder, what if there was something to the story after all? The more they asked, the more questions piled up, and soon it was no longer just the town that wondered, it was the community at large. It was an unlikely gathering, 7 strangers brought together by a shared experience that none of them fully understood. They had never met before, but something about the events of that night made it impossible to ignore each other. It was Luca who first suggested they meet. He had grown tired of trying to make sense of it alone, and his frustration led him to reach out to the others. He had seen their faces in the town square, heard their voices in passing, each one of them speaking with a hesitation, as if unsure how much to reveal. One by one, they gathered in a small room at the local community hall. At first, there was a palpable awkwardness between them, a silent tension as they sat around the table, unsure of where to start. But as the minutes passed, the walls came down. They began to share their stories, speaking with a quiet urgency. There were no dramatic gestures or wild claims, just the quiet certainty that something extraordinary had happened, and each of them had felt it. Sophia was the first to speak. She recounted the moment she had stepped out onto her balcony, the way the sky had seemed different that night, how she had been drawn to the strange lights. As she spoke, her words were met with nods and murmurs of recognition. Each of them had felt it, the inexplicable pull, the sense that they were witnessing something far beyond the ordinary. As they continued, they realized that their stories lined up in strange and unexplainable ways. Marco spoke of the light's sudden shift in direction, its movements sharp and deliberate, while Carla recalled how the lights appeared to hover, then dart off at impossible speeds. Every detail seemed to fit into place, piece by piece, and as each new account was shared, the group felt a growing sense of disbelief and wonder. It wasn't just that they had seen something, it was that what they saw defied every explanation they could imagine. They began to look at each other differently, seeing not just strangers but fellow witnesses to a shared event. The skepticism that had lingered in their minds melted away, replaced by a strange camaraderie. They were no longer alone in their confusion, but part of something bigger, something they still couldn't fully comprehend. And yet, there was a weight to their realization. They were not the only ones who had witnessed it. The town had heard their story, and it had been met with doubt. What did this mean for them? For their lives? The weight of secrecy hung over them, even as they spoke openly among themselves. They all felt it, the sense that they were on the verge of uncovering something that might never be understood, that could change everything. As the meeting came to an end, they lingered in the room a little longer, unsure of what to do next. The uncertainty was still there, but now it was shared. Together, they had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. The town was still reeling from the sightings, but the local authorities were already eager to move on. The mayor had dismissed it as nothing more than a figment of overactive imaginations. The police chief, having dealt with his fair share of odd reports, was quick to label it as a case of mass hysteria. No evidence, no problem. As far as they were concerned, the story was over before it had even begun. But for the 7 witnesses, that wasn't enough. The need to know more burned inside them. They had seen something that refused to be easily explained away. They could feel it in their bones, that unshakable sense that they had stumbled upon a mystery that demanded to be solved. Without any official help, they decided to take matters into their own hands. The first step was simple photographs. Though no one had managed to capture the full scope of the sighting that night, several of them had taken images, whether out of curiosity or in the hopes of documenting something strange. Each photograph was scrutinized under a new light. They zoomed in on the edges, the blurry streaks of light, trying to discern any clue that might hint at the true nature of the object. Sophia, who had always been a keen observer of the night sky, was the first to point out something curious. Look at the way the light shifts here. It's not just moving in one direction. It's weaving, almost like it's analyzing the environment. She leaned in closer to the photo, tracing the movement with her finger. It's not just random. It's purposeful. Her words struck a chord with the others. What if the lights weren't a random phenomenon? What if they were deliberate? That thought lingered in their minds as they began to gather other forms of evidence. Marco, the local farmer, who had been the most reluctant to speak up, offered something unexpected. He had a grainy video taken with his phone, shot from his fields. It was shaky, the quality poor, but it showed something unmistakable. A flickering shape, darting across the sky in ways that no conventional aircraft could mimic. Excited by the discovery, they started looking for more footage. Carla, who worked at the local cafe, spoke with regulars who had been outside that night, asking if anyone had recorded anything. A few people had, but most had deleted the footage, dismissing it as too strange to keep. But one man had held on to his, an elderly man who had been sitting on his porch, observing the scene with an intensity that came from years of experience. His video didn't show much, but the object's sudden stop, hovering in midair, was visible. The evidence was starting to pile up, and the group felt a growing sense of purpose. They knew they weren't going to get the answers they wanted from the authorities, but they weren't about to let the mystery slip through their fingers. Each new piece of information, each photo, each video, fueled their determination. They were on the verge of something that could change everything, and they were not going to stop until they uncovered the truth. It had been weeks since the first sighting, but the feeling of unease hadn't left the town. The witnesses, still grappling with what they had seen and experienced, found themselves drawn together again. Each meeting marked by a quiet desperation. They had uncovered strange photographs, debated the meaning of the flickering lights, and pieced together the fragments of their separate accounts. But none of it felt complete. There were still more questions than answers, and the unsettling sense that something was being hidden weighed heavily on their minds. Then, one night, it happened again. The lights appeared in the distance, much as they had before, but this time there was no mistaking their intensity. They were closer, so close that it felt as though they were right above the town. The orange glow that had once been a faint flicker now filled the sky, casting shadows against the rolling hills. It was impossible to ignore. A strange pulsing rhythm emanated from the lights, almost like a heartbeat that could be felt in the chest. The witnesses didn't hesitate. They had learned from the first encounter not to waste any time. Marco, who had been the first to suggest gathering physical evidence, was already on his phone, calling the others. Within moments, they were gathering in the town square, an unspoken agreement passing between them that they would face whatever this was together. As they arrived, the lights shifted, moving in a way that felt deliberate, calculated. The group stood in silence, watching as the glowing orbs hovered above the town, bobbing gently in the night sky. No aircraft, no conventional explanation could account for the way they moved. No steady flight path, no logical trajectory. They darted erratically, stopping suddenly, then veering off in another direction. They were too perfect in their unpredictability. Sophia's voice broke the silence, her words trembling slightly as she spoke. "It's like they know we're here." The thought hung in the air, thick with meaning. Was it possible? Could these lights, whatever they were, be aware of them? Her words resonated with the others, and they shifted uneasily. They all stood in awe, not daring to move too much, as though afraid that any sudden action might disturb the delicate balance of this strange, otherworldly encounter. Each of them felt it, the pull, the compulsion to understand, to reach out to whatever was out there. They were connected now, bound by the knowledge that the phenomenon was far from ordinary. The lights circled, growing brighter, then dimming slightly before bursting back to life in a brilliant flash that illuminated the landscape. It was as if they were testing their limits, challenging the group to make a move, to understand what they were seeing. No one spoke. The tension was suffocating, but it was also exhilarating. The mystery was deepening, and the urgency to find answers had never been more pressing. But the lights were not there to offer them clarity. They were a reminder. This wasn't over, and it might just be the beginning. As the lights hovered above, casting their eerie glow over the town, the group watched in silence, each person caught in the same spell of wonder and unease. But for one of them, that night would change everything. Luca, a quiet man who had kept to himself during the earlier encounters, suddenly staggered back, his hand gripping his chest. At first, no one noticed. They were all too fixated on the lights in the sky, their movements growing more erratic by the second. But when Luca collapsed onto the cobblestone street, a sharp gasp rippled through the group. Marco rushed to his side, kneeling beside him as the others scrambled to gather their bearings. Luca's face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His breathing came in shallow, labored gasps, and his hands trembled as if struck by a sudden, violent tremor. It wasn't until he managed to murmur something between breaths that anyone understood. "I felt it," he croaked. It touched me." The others exchanged uneasy glances. "What do you mean?" Sophia asked, her voice tight with concern. "I don't know," Luca whispered, his voice trembling with confusion and fear. "It was like a pressure, like something was pushing down on me, but it wasn't physical. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it in my chest, like my heart was being squeezed." Then everything went dark. The group gathered closer, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Marco's hands were steady as he checked Luca's pulse, which was erratic but still there. "He's alive," Marco muttered, though the words did little to reassure the others. The lights in the sky remained unchanged, undisturbed by the events below. They continued to swirl and pulse, as if they were oblivious to the chaos they had just caused, or perhaps indifferent. Luca was helped to his feet, still weak and dizzy, but the strange sensation had subsided. His face was ashen, the fear in his eyes unmistakable. "We need to figure out what this is," he muttered, barely able to stand. "Whatever it is, it's not just lights. It's something else." The group nodded in agreement, the gravity of Luca's experience sinking in. It wasn't just an optical illusion, a trick of the mind, or the weather. Something was happening to them, something they couldn't explain. The lights weren't just a phenomenon, they were having an effect on the people who dared to watch. As Luca slowly regained his composure, the group stood in a huddle, contemplating what to do next. This encounter had crossed a line. The lights were no longer just an oddity, they were now a threat. And the threat was closer than they'd ever imagined. For the first time, the question wasn't just what the lights were or where they came from. It was whether they could be stopped, or worse, if they could be controlled. The urgency to understand had shifted to something far more dangerous: survival. The group had gathered again in the dimly lit town hall, the same place where they'd first met to discuss the lights. This time, there was no excitement or curiosity in their voices. There was only frustration and a growing sense of being ignored. After their latest encounter, they had all agreed it was time to take their findings to the authorities. Surely, someone with the power to investigate would take their claims seriously. But as the days passed, they began to feel like they were shouting into an empty void. Sophia had been the first to contact the local police, and her report had been met with what could only be described as dismissal. "There's no need to waste our time with this kind of thing," the officer had told her, his voice dripping with mockery. "There's no UFO over your town. You've all been drinking too much wine, that's all." She tried again, reaching out to government representatives, hoping that anyone would listen. The response was the same: cold, dismissive silence, followed by snide remarks. One email even suggested they might be better off seeing a therapist. It wasn't long before the witnesses realized they were being pushed aside, as if their experiences had no value. It wasn't just the police or local officials. There was a far deeper silence, a collective avoidance that seemed to stretch beyond their small town. The more they reached out, the less they were heard. It felt like they were being deliberately silenced. Luca clenched his fists in frustration as he recalled his attempts. "I spoke to a man at the Ministry of Defense," he said quietly, the words filled with bitter disbelief. "He laughed at me, told me there was no such thing as UFOs in Italy. No official reports, no classified files, just wild stories. They didn't even take my name." Marco, who had tried his luck with a more direct approach, nodded gravely. "I went to the regional government office. The secretary just handed me a pamphlet on general hysteria and suggested I take a walk. That was the official response. The group sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the words hanging in the air. Sophia was the first to speak, her voice sharp with frustration. "This isn't right. We saw what we saw. We can't just let them pretend nothing happened." Her eyes flicked toward the window, where the darkening sky offered no comfort, no answers. "They're hiding something. They don't want us to know the truth." It was a chilling thought. The witnesses, who had once been eager to share their extraordinary experience with the world, now found themselves wondering if they had made a mistake. Had they been foolish to think that anyone would care? Or was something far more sinister at play? In the absence of answers, fear began to creep in, not just about the lights in the sky, but about the reasons they were being pushed aside. What were they being kept in the dark about? The more they tried to understand, the more they felt like pawns in a game they couldn't even see. Their experience had become more than just a mystery, it had turned into a conspiracy. And as the silence around them deepened, the questions only grew louder. It began with a single light, distant but distinct, hovering just above the tree line. The witnesses, now accustomed to the strange occurrences, watched it with a mix of anticipation and confusion. But this time, something was different. The light flickered in patterns that were too deliberate, too intentional to be mere chance. It wasn't just a flash in the sky, it seemed to pulse, shifting from one color to another, then pausing, before resuming its rhythmic dance. It was almost as if the sky itself was trying to speak. Luca was the first to suggest what they were all beginning to feel. "It's like it's trying to tell us something," he whispered, his voice tight with the weight of the realization. He had always been the skeptic, but now his words carried the gravity of someone who had seen the impossible. At first, the others thought it was a coincidence, a strange cloud formation, or a trick of the light. But as the patterns continued night after night, they began to understand. The lights weren't random. They followed a sequence that seemed purposeful. There were flashes, then pauses, then flashes again. The intervals never quite the same, but always following an unmistakable rhythm. Maria, who had been the most hesitant to believe in any sort of supernatural explanation, was the next to speak up. "I'm not crazy," she muttered, almost to herself. "It's trying to communicate." Her words hung in the air, uncertain but clear. They watched the sky together, transfixed. The patterns began to change over time, subtle shifts in the intensity and colors of the lights. It was as if they were being led through an invisible maze of cosmic signals, each one a puzzle piece slipping into place. Sophia, feeling the weight of what was unfolding, suggested they try to decode it. "What if we're missing something? What if the lights are trying to tell us how to understand what we saw?" The group tried different things. They began recording the light patterns, noting the timings and colors. They shared their observations with each other, piecing together the fragments of the strange communication. It didn't take long for them to agree that the messages were too precise to ignore. Sometimes, the lights would form a long sequence of flashes, then stop for several moments, only to begin again, as if giving them time to process. Other times, the flashes seemed to cluster together in groups, mirroring the rhythm of human speech or even Morse code. A sense of urgency took over them. They weren't just passive observers anymore. They were participants in something larger, something beyond their comprehension. The lights weren't just random occurrences, they were intentional signals. But what did they mean? What was the purpose behind them? The more they studied the lights, the more they felt that they were being drawn into a cosmic conversation, one they weren't quite ready to understand, but couldn't ignore. In the darkness of the sky, there was an unseen force trying to bridge the gap between them and the unknown, and though they were no closer to uncovering the truth, they knew one thing for certain. The sky wasn't silent anymore. It was speaking to them, and they had to listen. The air in the small town was thick with whispers, when Alessandra, a journalist from the city, arrived. She had heard about the sightings from a local newspaper report, dismissed as sensationalism at first, but something about the story lingered, gnawing at her curiosity. She knew the power of a good story, one that could shake the public's perception of reality. What she didn't expect was to find the truth buried in the faces of ordinary people. The first meeting was tentative. The witnesses, though eager to share, were still grappling with their own disbelief. They weren't sure what to make of their experiences, let alone explain them to someone else. But as Alessandra listened, something shifted. The weight of their accounts, their voices trembling as they recounted the strange lights and the inexplicable feelings they had shared, made her question everything she thought she knew about the world. Alessandra had covered a lot of stories in her career, but nothing like this. She had witnessed the public's obsession with UFOs, the skepticism, the ridicule. But now, hearing their stories in person, she felt the undeniable truth in their words. It wasn't just the lights in the sky, it was the way they described it, the confusion and fear that had taken hold of them, the unsettling sense that something greater was at play. The witnesses didn't need to convince her. The conviction in their eyes told her everything. In the days that followed, Alessandra began to dig deeper. She interviewed the witnesses one by one, asking them for every detail they could recall. She wrote tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of their accounts. There were inconsistencies. Of course, tiny details that didn't quite fit, but the bigger picture was undeniable. There was something extraordinary happening, and it was no longer a story for the small town alone. When Alessandra's article hit the local news, it caught the attention of more than just the curious. The ripple effects were immediate. Calls flooded in from neighboring towns, people claiming to have seen similar lights. News outlets from the city contacted her, asking for more details, demanding answers. The witnesses, once hesitant, now found themselves at the center of a media storm. It was a strange feeling for them, part relief, part anxiety. They weren't sure if they were ready for the attention, but it was happening, whether they were prepared or not. With Alessandra's article, the case gained traction. What had started as a quiet mystery, confined to the borders of a small Italian town, began to break free, moving beyond the whispers and shadows. The truth, once hidden in the night sky, was now making its way into the light. And with every new voice that spoke up, the questions grew. What were they witnessing? Was it just a coincidence, or was something far more extraordinary unfolding before their eyes? The witnesses were no longer alone in their search for answers. The world was starting to listen, and the truth, however elusive, was beginning to leak into the open. In the weeks following the journalist's article, the UFO sightings grew more frequent, and with them, an unsettling pattern began to emerge. The strange lights in the sky seemed to be following a rhythm, appearing at the same times, in the same locations. They didn't just light up the night, they seemed to be observing, studying, and perhaps even testing the reactions of those who had witnessed them before. As the witnesses gathered again to compare notes, the realization settled upon them. Something far more intricate was unfolding. The encounters had become almost like clockwork, and each time the lights appeared, they seemed to behave in ways that defied explanation. At first, they simply hovered, casting an eerie glow across the landscape. But now, they began to move with deliberate intention, circling above the town before darting off at impossible speeds. Some of the witnesses, still shaken by their initial experience, had begun to wonder if they had somehow been chosen. But for what? And by whom? As they met in secret, whispering nervously about what they had seen, a chilling theory took root. Could they, unknowingly, have become part of some larger experiment? The idea seemed preposterous, yet every new sighting, every strange anomaly, seemed to point in that direction. The lights were no longer just an unknown phenomenon. They were a force, and the witnesses had become its subjects. The more they reflected, the more the pieces seemed to fit together. One witness, a middle-aged mechanic named Franco, recalled how the lights appeared to interact with his own body. He'd felt a strange sensation, like a faint but distinct buzzing in his chest, as though something were scanning him. Others had similar experiences, ranging from dizziness to a sudden loss of memory. Was it possible that the lights, or whatever controlled them, were experimenting on them, testing the limits of their physical and mental boundaries? What bothered them even more was that these experiments didn't seem random. It was as if the lights were responding to their actions, their movements, even their thoughts. One witness, Valentina, had stood in the same spot every time she saw the lights. And each time, they would pause directly above her, as if aware of her presence. Was the UFO selecting individuals for these experiments? And if so, why them? Why this town? The more the group pondered, the more they realized they had been unknowingly drawn into something much larger than they could comprehend. Were these beings from another world simply observing them? Or were they conducting tests, gathering data on human reactions, emotions, perhaps even something far more profound? As fear began to creep in, the witnesses agreed on one thing. They had no choice but to continue. Each new encounter only brought them closer to the answers they desperately sought, yet it also pushed them further into the unknown. There was no going back. Whatever this was, it wasn't a random event, it was deliberate. And the experiment, whatever it truly was far from over. As the sightings continued to intensify, the sense of awe that had once filled the witnesses slowly began to shift into something darker. The UFO had gone from a distant mystery in the sky to an ever-present force hovering over their lives. Each night, the lights would appear closer, brighter, and more erratic, haunting their dreams, keeping them awake with the silent thrum of an unseen presence. What had started as curiosity and confusion soon turned to an unshakable dread. The group began to feel the effects of their encounters in ways they hadn't anticipated. For some, it was the dreams. Every night, they would be plagued by vivid visions, swirling lights in dark skies, voices calling out in languages they couldn't understand, and vast, shadowy figures standing just outside their reach. These dreams were always the same, terrifying and fragmented, as if their minds were being tested in ways they couldn't explain. When they woke, the fear lingered like a heavy fog, clinging to them throughout the day, and many of them started to feel an overwhelming sense of unease, as though they were being watched even when the UFO wasn't in sight. For others, the fear was more visceral. Antonio, the quiet shopkeeper, had always prided himself on his rational mind, but he couldn't deny the gnawing terror that grew within him each time the lights reappeared. His hands would tremble, his breath quicken, and his thoughts would scatter. It wasn't just the lights that frightened him. It was the sense of being powerless, of being caught in something beyond his control. There was no explanation, no way to fight back, just the oppressive feeling that something was always lurking, always just out of reach. As the sightings grew more frequent, the group found themselves drawn to each other in ways they hadn't expected. They met more often, exchanging not only their sightings but also their growing unease. The shared fear began to bind them, even as they struggled to understand what was happening. But each time they tried to discuss it rationally, something in the back of their minds told them that their understanding was slipping away, that they weren't meant to grasp it fully. There were things happening that no one was prepared for, things that defied their ability to make sense of it all. And then there was the silence. As the encounters became more intense, the people who had once shown curiosity began to retreat, refusing to acknowledge what was happening. Local authorities still refused to intervene, their dismissals growing colder, as if the truth was something they were determined to bury. The witnesses had become isolated, pushed to the margins of their own town, their own lives. They felt alone in their terror, as though the more they searched for answers, the deeper they were being pulled into a darkness they didn't fully understand. Fear was no longer just an emotion. It was a presence, a force that had taken root in their lives, tightening its grip with every passing day. And no matter how hard they tried, the question lingered in the air. Was this just the beginning of something even darker? It was late one evening when Laura, one of the 7 witnesses, noticed something strange in the way the lights in the sky moved. For weeks, she had been staring up at the sky, watching the flashes and patterns. But on this night, something felt different. The lights were shifting in an almost rhythmic pattern, not random at all, as she had previously assumed. They seemed to pulse, almost like a language, like some kind of message. Her mind raced. It couldn't be possible. Could the UFO be trying to communicate with them? The thought felt absurd, but the more she watched, the more certain she became. The lights were no longer just erratic flashes. They were structured, precise, as if they were following a deliberate sequence. With every pulse, a thought began to form in Laura's mind. She was witnessing something far more complex than a mere UFO sighting. There was intent behind it. She grabbed her notebook, the one she had started carrying around to document each encounter. Her hands shook as she scribbled down what she saw. The lights seemed to flash in specific intervals. 2 quick bursts, followed by a long pause, then another short pulse. As she observed, she realized that this pattern repeated in a consistent way. Her pulse quickened as the realization hit. It was a code, a pattern, a message. Laura couldn't believe it at first. How could this be happening? She spent the next several hours in her living room, sketching the patterns in her notebook. As the night wore on, she became more engrossed in trying to decode the flashes, convinced that the lights held some hidden meaning. What if this was more than just an alien presence? What if it was a form of communication, something they had all missed in the chaos of their initial fear and confusion? She enlisted the help of the others, showing them the sequences she had written down. At first, they were skeptical, but as they examined the patterns together, a strange sense of unity washed over them. The more they analyzed, the more they noticed the same patterns emerging in different sightings, as though the lights were trying to convey something important, something they were all meant to see. But what was the message? As they sat together, piecing together the code, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that the lights weren't just signals, they were warnings. They were being observed, and they were being tested. A chill ran down her spine as she wondered if they were part of something far bigger than they could comprehend, part of a plan that had been set into motion long before they ever noticed the lights in the sky. They weren't just witnessing something unexplainable, they were part of it. And now, they had to figure out what that meant before it was too late. As the weeks passed, the quiet town of Pieve di Colagnola, once known for its serene atmosphere and tight-knit community, began to unravel. The UFO sightings that had captivated the witnesses were now a constant undercurrent in daily life, leaving a profound mark on everyone. At first, it was merely an unsettling curiosity. People exchanged nervous whispers about the lights in the sky, but soon, the reality of their presence began to sink in. What had started as a series of strange occurrences had grown into something all-consuming, something the townspeople could no longer ignore. The local businesses began to feel the strain first. At the corner bakery, where warm loaves of bread once greeted morning customers, the shelves began to gather dust. The baker, Pietro, had once been a cheerful figure, always ready to share stories with his regulars, but now he stood behind the counter, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. The strange lights had caused him sleepless nights, and the overwhelming sense of fear that had settled in the town made it difficult to even consider returning to normal. The bakery closed its doors earlier each day, and soon, it stopped opening altogether. It wasn't just the businesses that were impacted. The social fabric of the town, once woven with decades of shared history and familiarity, began to fray. Neighbors who had once shared long conversations over fences now kept to themselves, avoiding eye contact when they passed on the street. The town square, which had always been the heart of community life, was eerily silent. The usual bustle of children playing, merchants selling their wares, and families gathering for evening strolls had been replaced by nervous glances and a pervasive sense of unease. What troubled the people most wasn't just the uncertainty of the sightings, but the fear of what they couldn't see. It wasn't simply the lights in the sky anymore, it was the growing sense that something far more insidious was at play, that perhaps the UFOs were watching them, analyzing them, and even influencing their lives. Those who hadn't witnessed the lights were now doubting their own perception, questioning if they were missing something, if their safety was in jeopardy. Rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by uncertainty and speculation, as each day brought more bizarre stories from the witnesses. Everyone began to feel the pressure. The once vibrant social events, the weekly market, the quiet dinners at the local restaurant, all seemed to fade away as the weight of the mystery consumed them. People stopped asking how each other was doing. It was as though the very fabric of community had dissolved, replaced by suspicion, fear, and isolation. The town was being altered, but not by any tangible force. It was as if the very air itself had been infected with the paranoia of the unknown. Pieve di Colonnola was slowly losing its identity. The UFO sightings had shattered its peace, and though the town still stood, it felt like the first cracks in a much larger, irreversible change. The townspeople knew they couldn't ignore what had happened anymore, but they didn't know if they could hold on to the life they once had. They were no longer just victims of strange lights in the sky, they were living in the shadow of something much darker. As the days wore on, the UFO sightings became a mere backdrop to something more disturbing. The once mysterious lights in the sky were now only part of the story, overshadowed by an unsettling presence that seemed to linger just beyond the edges of the town. The witnesses, who had shared their accounts of strange lights and inexplicable phenomena, began to experience something far more sinister. They no longer just saw the UFO in the sky. They began to feel it in the shadows. It started with subtle moments. A feeling of being watched, a glance over their shoulder to find no one there. But soon, it became undeniable. The witnesses began to report seeing figures lurking in the dark corners of the town, always just out of clear sight, but never far enough to be dismissed as a trick of the light. Some spoke of tall, shadowy figures that seemed to glide silently through the streets, always avoiding the light, always staying just outside the reach of recognition. They were faceless, indistinct, and yet their presence was suffocating. It was as if the town itself had become a stage for something much larger, something that was keeping track of every movement, every word spoken, every glance exchanged. The paranoia was impossible to shake. The witnesses, now bound together by their shared experiences, spoke in hushed tones, their conversations no longer about the lights in the sky, but the figures that watched them. They began to wonder if the UFOs were no longer the threat. It was the people or beings who followed them, those who seemed to shadow their every step, never seen clearly but always felt. The town's streets, once familiar and welcoming, now felt like a maze, with the shadows growing longer as the days stretched on. The once bustling town square, now eerily silent, felt more like an open space for observation than a community gathering place. Eyes seemed to follow every movement. The witnesses couldn't help but wonder, were these figures real? Or were they projections, the result of their minds unraveling under the weight of what they had seen? Each of the witnesses began to experience different forms of this unseen surveillance. Some would hear soft footsteps behind them, only to turn and find no one. Others would catch fleeting glimpses of figures in the periphery of their vision, figures that vanished the moment they turned their gaze. But the feeling of being watched was consistent. Every witness felt it, and it gnawed away at their sense of security. The realization set in that they were no longer just dealing with an extraordinary event. They were now involved in something far more insidious, something that felt like an experiment, a test they couldn't escape. Soon, the town began to fracture. People stopped trusting one another, questioning whether they were all being observed, manipulated, or perhaps even controlled. The quiet town of Pieve di Colonnola had once felt like a safe refuge. Now, it was a place where secrets hid in the dark, and where no one could be sure if they were alone or if the shadows were watching them. The UFO sightings in Pieve di Colonnola had captured the attention of the world. What began as a strange occurrence in a small Italian town had quickly turned into an international phenomenon. News outlets, social media platforms, and UFO forums buzzed with reports, speculations, and theories. The once quiet town was now a hotspot for journalists, enthusiasts, and researchers, all eager to uncover the truth behind the mysterious lights. Visitors from across the globe flocked to the town, eager to speak with the witnesses, to capture footage, and to add their voice to the growing narrative. At first, the witnesses had felt a sense of validation. People were finally listening to their stories. But that feeling quickly soured as the attention grew more invasive. The original group, who had come together out of shared experience, now found themselves cornered by cameras and microphones, their every word scrutinized, their lives dissected in front of a global audience. The town, once a peaceful haven, had transformed into a circus. Journalists, eager for the next big scoop, began to camp outside the witnesses' homes, knocking on doors, begging for interviews, and pushing for exclusive footage. Every quiet moment was interrupted by the incessant click of cameras or the barrage of questions from strangers. The witnesses began to feel the weight of the media frenzy pressing down on them. What had once been their personal experience, something they shared among themselves, was now the subject of mass consumption. People who had no understanding of their trauma now felt entitled to it. They were no longer seen as the ones who had encountered the unknown. They were now characters in a story that others were telling. Their words were twisted and taken out of context, their emotions reduced to headlines designed to grab attention. They were no longer the subjects of their own narrative. They were the raw material for the sensational stories the media craved. The original group, once united in their quest for answers, and began to fracture under the strain. Some of the witnesses retreated into silence, unwilling to speak any further, hoping the chaos would eventually subside. Others tried to reclaim their voices, but their words were drowned out by the constant barrage of questions. They felt as though they had lost control of their own story. The UFO sightings, once an incredible and personal experience, had become a spectacle, something to be commodified and consumed by an eager public. And with each new interview, each new article, the witnesses grew more resentful. They couldn't escape the feeling that they had become nothing more than pawns in a larger game. The town had turned into a stage, the lights now focused on them, but not in the way they had hoped. The truth they had once sought was becoming harder to find as the story they had lived became just another sensational headline. The arrival of the team of scientists brought a glimmer of hope to the witnesses, at least at first. A group of professionals in lab coats, and with credentials that seemed to offer legitimacy to the unfolding mystery, they arrived with a sense of purpose, promising to study the phenomenon in a way that would bring clarity and perhaps answers. They were from well-known institutions, and their assurances that they were there to help instilled a momentary sense of relief. After all, these were the kinds of people the witnesses had been hoping would show up. Those who could provide solid, scientific backing to their accounts. The team set up their equipment in the town, deploying high-tech tools and instruments that promised to gather data from every angle. Specialized cameras, thermal sensors, and electromagnetic field detectors were placed in various locations, scanning the skies, the ground, and even the witnesses themselves. The scientists spent long hours with the group, asking questions, recording everything, taking samples, and conducting experiments. Their focus was unwavering, their methods thorough. Yet, as time went on, a subtle shift began to take place. The team's professional demeanor gave way to an undercurrent of tension. It wasn't so much what they did, but what they didn't do. They didn't offer any reassurance. They didn't acknowledge the strain the witnesses were under. They didn't provide any answers. Instead, they simply observed, analyzed, and documented. As the days passed, the witnesses started to feel increasingly like subjects in a study, not participants in a search for truth. The scientists seemed more interested in the phenomenon as an intellectual challenge than in the emotional and psychological toll it was taking on the people who had witnessed it. There were moments when the team's inquiries veered into uncomfortable territory, asking for personal details that seemed irrelevant to the study. Their interest in the emotional impact of the sightings, for instance, seemed superficial, almost as if they were collecting data for a paper rather than for understanding the witness's trauma. Questions about the phenomenon were met with vague answers. "We're still compiling data," they'd say. "We need more time to study the patterns." The promises of revelation of uncovering the truth began to sound hollow, as if the team had no intention of delivering anything tangible. It began to feel more like an exploitation of the situation, rather than an effort to understand it. The witnesses, once hopeful, started to feel the familiar weight of being misunderstood and used. They had trusted the scientists to provide some form of clarity, but now, it seemed that the only thing being gained was more data that might never see the light of day. The silence from the scientists after each study, each test, grew louder. No answers, no conclusions, just endless analysis. The town had become a research project, and they were no longer participants in an investigation but subjects under scrutiny. The promise of truth was slipping further away, replaced by a growing sense of abandonment. As the days wore on, the witnesses began to notice something even stranger than the lights in the sky. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but as they compared notes, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Hours would pass, and yet it felt as though they had only been standing outside for moments. The feeling of time slipping away, of losing track of entire segments of the day, started to haunt them. It wasn't just the sensation of time passing too quickly, but the inexplicable gaps in memory that accompanied it. One moment, they'd be watching the sky, and the next, they'd find themselves miles away from where they had been, with no recollection of how they'd gotten there. At first, they tried to chalk it up to stress or exhaustion, perhaps a side effect of their growing anxiety. But as the occurrences became more frequent, it became clear that something far more profound was at play. One witness, Maria, could barely recall entire stretches of the evening she had spent outside with the others, only to find herself standing in the same spot hours later, confused and disoriented. Another witness, Carlo, mentioned feeling as though he had been awake for an entire night, only to realize that it was still the same evening, the same time as when the strange lights had first appeared. It was as if they had been caught in some kind of temporal loop, an inexplicable wrinkle in time that bent and twisted without explanation. The most unsettling instance came when they decided to document their experiences by setting up cameras to record the skies during their regular vigils. When they reviewed the footage, something that should have been straightforward only added to the mystery. In the recorded tapes, the lights appeared as they had, but in between the moments of intense activity, the frames were blank, an eerie, disjointed stretch of time where nothing seemed to happen. It was as though the cameras had captured something, but had missed everything in between. Lost time, vanished minutes, or perhaps hours, that none of them could account for. It was as if time itself was being manipulated, playing tricks on their perception. No matter how hard they tried to piece together the fragments, it never made sense. Gaps in memory, missing hours, and an overwhelming sense of confusion clouded their every attempt to understand. Were they simply losing their minds? Or was the UFO somehow involved in distorting the very fabric of time itself? The more they pondered, the more unnerving it became. If the UFO could manipulate time in such a way, what else might it be capable of? The questions piled on, unanswered and endless. The witnesses began to wonder if they were at the mercy of something far greater than they had ever imagined. Something that controlled not just what they saw, but what they experienced in ways they couldn't even begin to comprehend. The night was colder than usual, a crispness in the air that seemed to sharpen their senses. Carlo and Luca had decided to venture further into the fields, away from the others, hoping to catch a better view of the UFO. It was almost like an instinct, a pull towards something they couldn't explain. The lights had become more frequent in recent days, and tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the very atmosphere was charged with anticipation. They reached the open clearing just as the first flicker of the UFO appeared on the horizon, glowing faintly at first, then growing brighter, hovering steadily in place. Carlo's heart raced, but this time, there was no fear. Instead, it was a mix of awe and something else. Something deeper, as if they were on the brink of witnessing something monumental. Without speaking, the two men slowly began walking toward the source of the light, their eyes fixed on the object above. It wasn't long before they noticed that the UFO had shifted, moving toward them as if it was aware of their presence. At first, it was subtle, a faint motion that could have been a trick of the light. But then, it became undeniable. The object was gliding closer, silently, as if it was floating effortlessly above the ground. As it approached, the air grew thicker, almost heavy, and a strange pressure seemed to settle around them. The lights grew brighter, more intense, illuminating the field in a strange, unnatural glow. Carlo felt a shiver run down his spine, but there was something hypnotic about it too, something that kept him rooted to the spot. When the object was just a few hundred feet away, it stopped. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. The UFO hovered in the air, its shape now clearer round, smooth, with no visible seams or markings. It pulsated softly, as if it was breathing, alive in a way that felt almost organic. Carlo and Luca exchanged a look, both realizing they were witnessing something no one else would ever believe. But then, something happened. A bright beam of light shot down from the underside of the UFO, striking the ground just a few feet from where they stood. The light was warm, yet unsettling, as it bathed them in its glow. It was as though the beam was scanning them, touching every part of them, probing in a way that made their skin prickle with both warmth and fear. They couldn't move. They were frozen, as if the very light was holding them in place. Luca's voice was barely a whisper, barely a thought. What do we do?" But there was no time to answer. The light lifted as suddenly as it had appeared, and the UFO began to drift back, retreating into the night sky, leaving behind nothing but a faint afterimage in their minds. As it vanished, so did the oppressive feeling in the air. The silence returned. Carlo and Luca stood there, breathless, their minds racing to comprehend what they had just experienced. It was more than they could process, more than they could understand. They hadn't just seen the UFO from a distance. They had been in its presence, felt its power, and, in some way, it had seen them too. What had it wanted? What had it done? The questions lingered. But one thing was clear. Nothing in their lives would ever be the same again. After weeks of rumors and uncertainty, the authorities finally launched an official investigation into the UFO sightings. A small team of local police officers, accompanied by a few members of the military, arrived in the town to conduct interviews and gather evidence. The witnesses, Carlo, Luca, and the others, were all asked to recount their experiences in detail. At first, it seemed like the beginning of some much-needed clarity, the promise that someone would finally take their claims seriously. But as the days wore on, the cracks began to show. The investigators were polite but distant, offering no indication that they believed anything extraordinary had occurred. They asked all the right questions, yet their demeanor felt rehearsed, as if they had already made up their minds about what the truth was. Some of the witnesses felt the weight of the skepticism in the air, the unspoken assumption that they were either mistaken or lying. There was no interest in the photographs they had taken or the patterns they had observed in the UFO's movements. The team seemed more focused on getting them to change their stories to fit the narrative they had already established. The most unsettling part, however, was what the investigators weren't doing. There was no genuine attempt to examine the location of the sightings with any real scrutiny. The ground where the UFO had hovered was left untouched, the area around it strangely undisturbed. No scientific equipment was brought in to measure the unusual electromagnetic readings that several of the witnesses had noted, nor was there any attempt to examine the strange marks on the ground that some had reported. Instead, the investigators seemed more interested in questioning the townspeople about their backgrounds and motivations, as if to discredit them, before they had even begun to consider the possibility that something real had occurred. As the investigation continued, certain facts began to slip through the cracks. Witnesses who had been interviewed were told that certain aspects of their accounts would remain confidential, but they quickly realized that some of what they had said was being omitted from official reports. Key details about the UFO's behavior, like its ability to seemingly communicate through light patterns or its unnerving proximity during the sightings, were glossed over. The authorities kept the public in the dark, repeating the same narrative that it was simply a case of mass hysteria or a natural phenomenon. The media, now increasingly interested in the case, we began to ask questions, but those too were met with a wall of silence. It was as if a deliberate effort was being made to suppress the truth, or at least to control what information reached the outside world. The more the witnesses tried to push for transparency, the more they felt like pawns in a game they didn't understand. It became painfully clear. The investigation wasn't about uncovering the truth, it was about protecting the status quo. The townspeople, including the witnesses, found themselves at a crossroads. They could no longer rely on the authorities to find the answers. But if they kept pressing, what would happen next? Would they be silenced? Or worse, made to disappear? The chilling reality began to set in. Sometimes the truth wasn't just hidden, it was actively buried. One evening, just as unexpectedly as it had appeared, the UFO vanished. The strange lights in the sky, which had captivated and terrified the witnesses for weeks, faded into the night without a trace. It happened in an instant, as if the object had simply decided to stop existing in the space it had occupied. One moment, the sky was filled with its unsettling glow, and the next, it was as though it had never been there at all. No flash, no explosion, just an eerie emptiness. The witnesses stood in stunned silence, eyes fixed on the spot where the UFO had hovered only moments before. It was as if the fabric of reality itself had bent, allowing the object to slip through unnoticed. There were no lingering sounds, no after effects, nothing to signify that the object had once been there at all. For a brief moment, a strange calm settled over the town, but it was short-lived. The questions began to flood in once again, more urgent than ever. Why had it left? Where had it gone? Had it been a one-time occurrence? Or was there more to this mysterious event than anyone could understand? The sense of relief that the object was no longer present was quickly overshadowed by the gnawing fear that the answers to their questions might never be found. The witnesses felt as if they had been part of something far larger than themselves, something they didn't fully comprehend. In the days that followed, The town's atmosphere shifted. People began to return to their routines, yet a strange unease lingered in the air. The UFO's sudden departure left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. Even those who had initially dismissed the sightings as a collective hallucination or mass hysteria could no longer ignore what had happened. Something unexplainable had entered their world, and its absence only made its presence more undeniable. For the witnesses, the experience became a silent burden. They could no longer look at the world in the same way. Every mundane detail, every passing plane, every flicker of light in the distance was a reminder of the extraordinary thing they had seen. Their lives, once ordinary, were now haunted by the knowledge that there were things in the universe they would never understand. And yet, despite the unanswered questions, there was a shared sense of unity among them. In the silence that followed the UFO's departure, the witnesses found solace in each other's company. They had seen something together, something that defied logic and reason, and that bond could never be undone. But with that bond came a heavy realization. The truth was still out there, elusive and hidden in the vastness of the unknown. The UFO had left, but the feeling it had instilled of something bigger, more mysterious than they could fathom, remained. As they went back to their lives, the question loomed larger than ever. What had really happened? And what would come next? The answers, they knew, would not come easily, but they were now forever tied to the mystery of the lights in the sky. The UFO had disappeared, leaving only silence in its wake, and with it, a growing void that none of the witnesses could fill. Despite the shared experience, despite the moments of terror and awe they had all felt together, no one seemed to have any clearer understanding of what had actually happened. The weeks that followed were marked by restless nights, haunted by flashes of light and strange sensations that none could fully explain. They met in small groups, talking in hushed tones, trying to find some sense in the chaos, but each conversation only left them more confused. They compared notes, each one recounting the same details, yet somehow, none of it added up. The lights in the sky, the unearthly stillness that accompanied the sightings, the sensation that time itself had been warped. None of it made sense when viewed together. There were so many questions, so many theories, but no answers. Why had the UFO appeared? Why had it left? And more troubling still, why had it chosen them, of all people, to witness its presence? The memories lingered, clear in their minds, yet impossibly hazy in their significance. Every night, as darkness settled over the town, each witness found themselves staring at the sky, half expecting the lights to return, to offer some kind of resolution. But nothing ever came. The UFO had vanished as quickly as it had arrived, and with it, any hope of gaining clarity. The authorities had said little, offering only brief statements that dismissed the incident as an anomaly, an unexplained event with no further significance. But the witnesses knew better. They knew what they had seen, and the lack of attention from those in power only made them more determined to seek answers. Still, there was no one to turn to, no one who seemed willing to listen. The world had moved on, as if the UFO had been nothing more than a fleeting moment of confusion. The emotional toll began to take its own form. Some of the witnesses grew distant, withdrawn, as if the weight of the unknown was too much to bear. Others became obsessed, poring over books, searching online for anything that might explain what they had witnessed. They scoured every piece of information, hoping for a clue, a sign that someone, somewhere, had an answer. But every theory seemed to contradict the last, every hypothesis leading to more questions, never to the truth they so desperately sought. Even as life went on around them, the unanswered questions loomed large. The world had not stopped spinning. And yet, for the witnesses, it felt as though their lives had been frozen in time, suspended in a moment they couldn't escape. They were caught in the quiet aftermath, the silence after the storm, and no matter how hard they searched, they couldn't shake the feeling that the answers they sought were just out of reach, hiding somewhere in the vast emptiness of the universe. Weeks after the UFO had disappeared, a figure emerged from the shadows, someone who had been watching from the sidelines, someone who knew more than they had let on. The whistleblower was not one of the witnesses, but someone with ties to the very authorities who had dismissed the events as inconsequential. A former government employee, disillusioned by what they had witnessed in the bureaucracy, had come forward, offering a clue that would alter everything the witnesses thought they knew. Late one evening, the whistleblower reached out, meeting one of the witnesses in a secluded area outside of town. The meeting was brief, but charged with an undeniable sense of urgency. In a plain envelope, the whistleblower handed over a set of documents, their contents marked in bold red ink, "Top secret, confidential." These were not just any papers. They were government files, carefully hidden away from the public eye. The whistleblower made no claims of knowing the full scope of the information, but their eyes conveyed a sense of weight, of something too big to ignore. The UFO sighting, it seemed, was not an isolated event but part of a much larger, classified project, one that had been ongoing for years. The documents were carefully examined in secret. They contained reports that confirmed the government had been tracking unexplained aerial phenomena for decades. There were references to various military programs, research into advanced technologies, and mentions of experimental aircraft. But one thing stood out: the dates. Several of the documents mentioned sightings that corresponded exactly with the time frame of the witnesses' encounter. The patterns were too precise, too intentional to be mere coincidence. Their encounter wasn't just an accidental brush with the unknown, it was linked to something larger, something the government had been monitoring and possibly orchestrating. The documents didn't offer full explanations, but they hinted at a connection between the UFO sightings and government-run research projects that involved advanced propulsion systems, studies into unknown materials, and, most disturbingly, experiments in human exposure to high-tech devices. The tone of the reports was unsettling, filled with cryptic language and vague conclusions, suggesting that what the witnesses had seen could very well be tied to secret government experiments, ones that were far more advanced than anything publicly acknowledged. As the witnesses pored over the files, the sense of fear and betrayal grew. What they had thought was an isolated, extraordinary experience now appeared to be part of a larger puzzle, one that had been hidden from the public for years. The implications were staggering. Were they part of an experiment, a mere piece of a larger project they could never understand? And if so, what did that mean for their safety, for the truth they had been seeking all along? The government had kept secrets before, but this was something else entirely. They couldn't allow themselves to be silenced. Not now that they had a glimpse into a world far darker and more controlled than they could have ever imagined. The documents, though incomplete, were proof that their encounter had not been a random event. It had been orchestrated, studied, and perhaps even manipulated. The questions were endless, and now they had more to fight for than ever before. The days following the UFO's departure passed slowly, and although the town slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy, the witnesses felt the weight of their experience settle deeper within them. What had been an extraordinary event that had once filled them with wonder was now a source of profound unease. The emotional toll began to manifest in ways none of them could have predicted. At first, it was small things, disruptive thoughts that seemed to come out of nowhere. But as time wore on, the effects grew stronger. Dreams turned into night terrors, vivid flashes of light, and strange shapes that seemed to reach into their very souls, never letting go. One witness, Maria, couldn't sleep without the haunting images of the UFO flashing in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the lights, felt the hum of the strange energy that surrounded it. The feeling wasn't just confined to sleep during the day. She would suddenly feel an overwhelming sense of dread, as though something was watching her, waiting for her to acknowledge it. The sense of being followed was constant, and even in the safety of her home, she felt the shadows creeping closer, as if the night had never truly left. For others, the strain was mental rather than physical. Tom found himself growing increasingly withdrawn, haunted by the nagging suspicion that he was losing touch with reality. He'd been a rational man before, a man of science and reason, but now, each passing day brought more doubts about his own sanity. He would look at the others who had witnessed the event, their once comforting faces now unfamiliar and strange, as if their connection to the event had altered them in ways he couldn't understand. They, too, seemed to carry the same haunted look in their eyes. Their faces were no longer just faces. They were reminders of a shared trauma they couldn't escape. The paranoia grew worse. Whispers of hidden surveillance, of strange figures lurking in the background, became almost obsessive. Were they being watched? Were their homes tapped? These thoughts would consume their waking hours, preventing any sense of peace. They would look over their shoulders, certain someone was watching from the shadows, and at times, they'd catch glimpses of fleeting figures in the corner of their eyes. But when they turned to look, there was nothing there, nothing but the creeping suspicion that their every move was being monitored. As the psychological toll mounted, some began to question whether the encounter had been real at all. Was it a shared hallucination, a mass delusion caused by stress and fear? Or had they all simply cracked under the weight of the extraordinary? The lines between reality and madness blurred as the psychological effects began to unravel them. The experiences, once thought to be shared by a group of people, now felt more like a dark, personal burden, each witness carried alone. They were left to wonder, had the UFO merely been a catalyst for something deeper, something darker within them? Or was there a more insidious force at play? The uncertainty gnawed at their minds, pushing them closer to the edge with each passing day. The witnesses, still reeling from their shared experience, found that their relationships with family and friends were the next battleground. They had come together to find some semblance of understanding, but those who had not been present for the UFO sighting couldn't grasp the weight of what they had seen. It was as if they were speaking a different language altogether, one of the mind, not the heart. At first, they tried to explain. They spoke of the lights in the sky, the way the object hovered, and how it moved in ways nothing human-made could. But the words felt hollow when they left their lips. The wonder they once felt had been replaced with a lingering dread, and the more they spoke, the more they could sense the disbelief creeping into the eyes of those they loved. Maria's husband, Marco, had always been her rock. He'd been the one to offer logical explanations, to calm her during moments of doubt. But this was different. This was something that could not be explained by science or reason. Marco listened, nodding politely, his face betraying his disbelief. When she spoke of the lights, of the way her skin had tingled with an electric charge, of the unsettling quiet that had settled in her mind, he gave her the kind of sympathetic smile one might offer a child who had imagined a scary monster in the closet. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he couldn't imagine what she was describing. And in the silence that followed, Maria began to feel like a stranger in her own home. Tom's sister, Laura, was more vocal in her skepticism. "It sounds like a dream, Tom. You've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe it was some sort of collective hallucination." The words stung. The notion that what had happened to him, something so profoundly real, could be dismissed as a figment of his imagination, left him feeling hollow. The pain of that rejection was sharper than any of the fear he'd felt when the lights had first appeared. To Laura, it was all too impossible. She couldn't fathom what he had witnessed, and so she refused to accept it. For some, the rejection wasn't just about disbelief, it was about fear. Friends who had once been close to the group started avoiding them, unsure of how to interact with people who had experienced something so foreign. How could they relate to something they couldn't even begin to understand? Some even went so far as to suggest the witnesses had fabricated their stories for attention or were simply overwhelmed by the pressure of the media circus that had descended on the town. In their eyes, the witnesses had become figures of ridicule, not truth-tellers. The more they were met with rejection, the more isolated the witnesses felt. They had once been a tight-knit community, but now it felt as though they were standing on the outside, looking in. It was a bitter realization what had once been shared in camaraderie now seemed like a burden they alone had to bear. Their families and friends had become strangers in their eyes, unable to understand the depth of their experiences, and in that isolation, they began to question if they would ever truly be believed. Months had passed since the UFO had left the sky, but the story was far from over. The witnesses, still haunted by the uncertainty of what they had experienced, were approached by a new team of investigators this time. From a private organization, independent of the government's involvement, they were determined to take a fresh look at the case, undeterred by the skepticism that had surrounded the initial investigation. This new team, unlike the authorities before them, seemed genuinely intrigued by the possibility that the sightings were not just a local anomaly, but part of something much larger. They brought with them fresh eyes and new questions, ones that the witnesses hadn't yet considered. Was it just coincidence that these sightings had happened in the small town of northern Italy? Or was there a broader, global pattern emerging? Had there been similar reports elsewhere, other places, other countries that might connect the dots in a way that made sense of what had happened? The team's first approach was to gather more detailed accounts from the witnesses. They returned to the original witnesses, eager to collect every scrap of evidence, photographs, videos, and even personal testimony, no matter how fragmented. The investigators' questions were thorough and precise, aiming to uncover every detail. What had they seen? How had they felt? What were the lights doing in the sky? How did their perception of time feel? Each question seemed designed to strip away the layers of doubt that had accumulated over time and get to the heart of the phenomenon. Meanwhile, the new investigators reached out to other regions, both within Italy and beyond, asking whether anyone had seen similar lights or experienced similar occurrences. The witnesses, who had felt so alone in their experience, found themselves connected to a much larger web of individuals who had observed strange phenomena in the skies. They were not alone. As it turned out, other towns across Europe, some as far away as Germany and France, had experienced similar sightings. It seemed the lights were not confined to one small corner of the world, but rather part of a sprawling global enigma. As the investigators dug deeper, they uncovered even more unsettling details. They interviewed experts in the field of astronomy, meteorology, and even physics. Could the sightings be attributed to known atmospheric phenomena or celestial events? The answer was always the same. There was no known explanation that fit the behavior of the UFO. The object's movements defied every logical explanation. Nothing terrestrial seemed capable of replicating the erratic flight patterns or the sudden disappearances. The investigators then shifted their focus to the data. Could the strange electromagnetic interference recorded during the sightings point to something more? Were these disturbances isolated events or part of a wider, unexplained pattern across the globe? The evidence seemed to be mounting. Something was happening, and the more they looked, the more they realized it wasn't just about one small town or one mysterious sighting. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the truth to surface. And with every piece of the puzzle the investigators uncovered, the questions grew. Was this the beginning of something much bigger? Or was this just another unexplainable event to be forgotten with time? The strange occurrence in northern Italy had left its mark on all the witnesses. But there was one thing none of them could shake: the missing time. Hours, Whole stretches of the evening seemed to have simply vanished. As they pieced together their recollections of the event, they realized with growing unease that large gaps in their memories had developed. One moment, they were watching the lights in the sky. The next, they were back in the same spot. But hours had passed. At first, they had brushed it off, chalking it up to the disorienting effect of the intense experience. But as the days turned to weeks and the initial shock began to fade, the memory gaps haunted them. It wasn't just a few minutes here and there, it was hours. It was as if time itself had been stretched, manipulated in a way that defied reason. What had happened during that time? Where had they been? What had they done? One witness, Marco, began to take the lead in trying to unravel the mystery. He had been an eager participant in the initial investigation, but now, the need for answers consumed him. He started keeping a detailed journal of his thoughts, his dreams, and any stray recollections that might emerge. It wasn't until weeks later, when Marco was reviewing his notes late at night, that a disturbing pattern began to surface. He had written in his journal that he had been seeing strange symbols in his dreams, symbols he didn't recognize but felt unnervingly familiar with. He recalled waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his body aching as though he had been somewhere else entirely. It was as if his mind had been elsewhere during those missing hours, his body left behind in the same spot, but a part of him had been somewhere far more sinister. Marco spoke to the others, and they began to compare their experiences. To their horror, each of them seemed to have experienced similar dreams, strange sensations, and most notably, a profound sense of being displaced in time. They hadn't just lost a few minutes, they had lost hours. The more they discussed it, the more the pattern took shape. Something had happened to them during the sighting. But what? Had they been taken by the UFO? Were they somehow involved in an experiment? The question gnawed at them. How had the UFO affected their perception of time? Could it be that they had been physically taken, moved, or altered in some way? Their memories, once so vivid, now felt fractured, incomplete. The idea that they might have been subjected to something far more profound than just a sighting. The thought that they could have been taken, even briefly, by the UFO became an unsettling possibility that none of them could deny. With no answers, only growing dread, they realized they were left with more questions than ever before. Had their minds been altered, their bodies manipulated? And more terrifyingly, who or what had taken them? As the days dragged on, the truth of the missing time seemed to slip further from their grasp, a mystery that might never be solved. But the unsettling feeling lingered. The UFO wasn't done with them yet. As the witnesses continued their search for answers, an unsettling realization began to dawn on them. What had initially felt like an isolated event, a strange and inexplicable encounter in their small town, was now beginning to take on global dimensions. They weren't alone in their experience. Across the world, people were reporting similar sightings, strange lights in the sky, mysterious objects that moved in ways no known aircraft could, and time distortions that mirrored their own. The UFO in northern Italy wasn't just a local phenomenon. It seemed to be part of something far larger. At first, they had all dismissed these reports as unrelated, isolated incidents, perhaps nothing more than coincidences. But as they dug deeper, connecting with other witnesses through online forums, news reports, and independent investigations, the pieces began to fit together. The similarities were too striking to ignore. From rural towns in South America to busy cities in Asia, there were sightings that mirrored their own in eerie detail. The lights, the odd behavior of the objects, the sense of being watched, or even followed, all of it was happening on a global scale. The witnesses started to share their findings with one another, piecing together a map of these occurrences. They discovered that the sightings weren't just sporadic or confined to one region. They spanned continents, appearing in places that shouldn't have any connection to their small town in Italy. What was once an isolated event had now become part of a larger, unexplained pattern, a pattern that seemed to be unfolding in real time across the globe. The more they looked, the more they realized that these events weren't limited to a few strange lights in the sky. There were reports of strange electromagnetic disturbances, power outages, and even altered weather patterns in the wake of these sightings. Some witnesses spoke of missing time, just as they had experienced, while others recounted disturbing dreams and a sense of being followed. The UFO was no longer just a local curiosity. It was a phenomenon with far-reaching consequences, its presence felt in cities and towns around the world. As the scope of the connection became clearer, the witnesses felt both a sense of solidarity and growing unease. What was the purpose of these global sightings? Was this just an isolated experiment, or was there something more at play? The idea that they might be part of something larger, something beyond their comprehension, filled them with both dread and fascination. Had they been chosen, like others, for some greater purpose? Or were they merely witnessing the beginning of something much more significant, something that could change the course of human history? What had started as a strange and unexplained event in their small town had now become a piece of a much larger puzzle. The global connection between these sightings couldn't be denied. And as they continued to dig, one question loomed over them all. Who or what was orchestrating this worldwide phenomenon? After weeks of uneasy silence, the UFO returned. It wasn't like the previous encounters. This time, the air felt different, charged, expectant, as if the very fabric of reality was holding its breath. The witnesses, who had long since formed a fragile bond over their shared experiences, stood together again, their eyes turned toward the sky with a mix of dread and curiosity. The lights appeared at the horizon, flickering at first, distant and almost shy, as if testing their resolve. But then, as the object grew closer, it began to reveal itself with a clarity that none of them had seen before. The strange iridescent glow pulsed in rhythmic patterns, the lights shifting in a sequence that almost seemed deliberate, almost like a communication. It hovered for a moment, suspended in the sky, casting an eerie light over the town. The witnesses stood frozen, watching as the UFO silently observed them, its presence heavy with the weight of unspoken knowledge. The world around them seemed to vanish, and all that remained was the object in the sky, drawing them in with its hypnotic glow. For the first time since the initial encounter, some of the witnesses felt a flicker of understanding. It was as if the object was no longer an enigma, but rather a message they were finally able to receive. The pattern of light seemed to convey something, an idea, a concept that they had been too blind to grasp before. The closer they looked, the more the pattern revealed itself. Flashes, shapes, symbols that appeared to move with intent, as if trying to bridge the divide between the unknown and the known. But with the new clarity came more questions. What did these patterns mean? Who, or what, was behind this strange intelligence? And why had the UFO returned now, after so many months of silence? It wasn't just the object's behavior that had changed. The witnesses themselves had changed as well. The fear that had once gripped them was now replaced with a strange, unsettling sense of calm. They weren't just observers of this phenomenon anymore, they were participants. This encounter, unlike the others, felt personal. It was as though the UFO was acknowledging them, as though it was trying to make them understand something about themselves or about the world around them that they hadn't seen before. As the UFO hovered just above them, an eerie thought crossed their minds. Perhaps it wasn't just the UFO that had returned. Perhaps it was something deeper, something in the fabric of their reality itself, shifting in ways they couldn't fully comprehend. The questions they had been asking for so long now seemed insignificant compared to the gravity of this moment, and yet, Even with all the answers it had brought, the UFO's return left them with a haunting certainty this was far from over. There was still more to uncover, and perhaps far more to fear. The final revelation came not in a single moment of clarity, but in a gradual unraveling of truth, pieced together by the experiences, theories, and symbols that had haunted the witnesses since the first sighting. The UFO, which had once seemed an inexplicable anomaly in the sky, was now the key to understanding a vast, hidden reality. As they sat together in a dimly lit room, their minds still reeling from the recent encounter, it all began to make sense in a way that was as terrifying as it was enlightening. The patterns in the lights, their deliberate sequences, were not random after all. They were a language, a form of communication that the witnesses had unknowingly begun to decode. The symbols, once seen as nothing more than flashes of light, were now understood as a message from something beyond their comprehension. What had appeared to be a series of cryptic signals was, in fact, a warning. A warning not just for them, but for humanity as a whole. They began to understand that the UFO was not a visitor from another planet, nor a product of some advanced government experiment. It was something far older, far more intricate. The object in the sky, the very phenomenon they had witnessed, was a tool, a messenger of sorts, sent by an intelligence beyond human understanding. It wasn't about contact or observation. It was about preservation. The UFO, in all its strange brilliance, had been sent to monitor Earth, to protect it from an impending threat that was as old as time itself. This intelligence, these beings or forces, had been watching humanity for millennia. They had observed the rise and fall of civilizations, the relentless march of progress and destruction. But now, as Earth stood on the precipice of irreversible change, they had returned. The UFO had not come to abduct or harm, but to warn, to deliver a final message. The time was running out. The planet was on the verge of an environmental collapse, a point of no return, and the UFO, their messenger, was the last attempt to ensure that humanity would take the right steps to avoid catastrophe. As the pieces came together, the witnesses realized that they were no longer simply passive observers. They had been chosen to carry this message, to awaken others to the truth. The UFO had not appeared to them by chance. They had been selected to witness the final warning. The world had ignored the signs for too long. And now, it was up to them to share what they had learned, no matter the cost. In the final moments, they understood the gravity of their role in this unfolding drama. The truth was both liberating and suffocating, a burden they could not ignore. As they gazed out into the night sky, the UFO vanished once more, leaving them with a new understanding of their place in the universe and the terrifying responsibility that came with it. The truth was out there, but whether humanity was ready to face it was another question entirely. The revelation of the truth had shattered their world in ways none of them had anticipated. What had once been a simple, albeit perplexing, encounter had evolved into an existential journey that left them forever changed. Each of the witnesses now carried the weight of knowledge about the UFO, its purpose, and the cryptic message it had delivered. But with the answers came a deeper uncertainty, a profound awareness that their lives could never be the same again. The sky, once a comforting and familiar sight, now seemed laden with unseen forces. In the days following the final encounter, the witnesses found themselves drifting between disbelief and acceptance. For a while, they tried to return to their normal routines, to pretend as though the weight of the knowledge didn't linger heavily on their shoulders. But it was impossible. The world around them seemed unchanged, yet they knew that everything was different. Their minds were filled with questions that had no answers, and their hearts weighed down by the responsibility of knowing the truth. How could they possibly go back to a life they had once known, when the universe had opened up to them in such an unsettling way? Some of them, like Paolo, tried to bury it all. He returned to work, focusing on menial tasks to avoid the gnawing thoughts that plagued his nights. He wanted to believe it had all been a bad dream, a shared illusion. But the recurring flashes of the UFO's lights, those symbols, those unspoken words, were impossible to escape. It wasn't just in his mind. It was a part of him now, embedded deep within his psyche. Others, like Lucia, sought comfort in silence. She retreated into herself, spending long hours by the river, watching the water flow by, hoping that time would help her heal. But as the days passed, she realized that there was no going back. The knowledge she carried could never be erased. She wondered if anyone would ever believe them if they spoke the truth. And even if they did, would it matter? The world seemed far too caught up in its own chaos to care about the things she had learned. Yet, amidst their personal struggles, they found solace in each other. Their shared experience had bound them together in a way that no one else could understand. They were no longer just individuals coping with the weight of the unknown. They were a community of witnesses, united by an encounter that transcended time, space, and understanding. In their shared silence, they found a quiet strength. In the end, the decision was made. They couldn't simply walk away from what had happened, but they could choose how to move forward. The knowledge they now held would remain a burden, but it was also a gift, one that would shape the rest of their lives. And while they couldn't change the world, perhaps, just perhaps, they could find peace in knowing that they had borne witness to something greater than themselves. Moving on wasn't about forgetting. It was about accepting what had been revealed and finding a way to live with it, one day at a time.